I'm very pleased to welcome back to St. Thomas Apostle Charles A. Coulombe, noted author, and maybe you've read his book on the Papal Zouaves or on Blessed Karl. He wrote the definitive English biography on Blessed Karl, and the last time that he was here, that book had just launched and you were signing books. And the good thing for us out of that is that's how we got Brother Noah. And so Brother Noah was part of a gaggle of Catholic University students that came for the talk. And so Blessed Karl, with a sense of humor, sent us a seminarian who looks just like him. And so we're very grateful that you're back and talking about Servant of God Zita and your forthcoming book. And I look forward to hearing about your book, and I look forward to reading it when you get it. But Charles Coulombe, as an American, currently lives in Austria, and there you studied at the Austrian Theological Institute. And if you haven't read his books, they're a pleasure, and I hope that you will pick up all of them and read them. And Charles, it's such a joy to welcome you back here to St. Thomas. And I hope that this is the second of many visits.
Volare, whoa. No, I won't do that to you, not yet. Your Imperial and Royal Highness, Reverend Fathers and Brothers, my lords, ladies, and gentlemen. Also, a couple of people I have to mention tonight. One is Eric Sorensen, who I have not seen since 1980 and had not seen before 1980. Our only connection is that we were on contending teams at the College Bowl in Boulder, Colorado in 1980. Yes, I was in college once too, lads, and I also addressed the prospective candidates for Delta Phi Epsilon at Georgetown. I hope you guys make it. I offer no guarantees. And to everyone else, it's wonderful to see you all. Oh, I can't forget the inimitable Terry Boyle, who longtime secretary of Delta Phi Epsilon and a fixture in Washington, D.C. There's actually an empty base in one of the circles. Never mind. Anyway, I shall now sit down. Oh. One of the things I've acquired since I was here last are annoying knees and fallen arches, but nothing to do with my last visit, Father. It's okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, and all, it is a great pleasure to be back here this evening. Actually, I don't have to even hold this. This is great. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? All right. Well, we're cooking with gas, as we used to say in my day. Once upon a time. Well, our topic this evening is Servant of God Zita, and we are going to be looking at her on a very fine day, the anniversary of her wedding. 2 years ago today, the centennial year of Blessed Karl's death, the ITI and a couple of other groups were able to sponsor a mass, a feast day mass, at the chapel where she and Karl were married, at Schwarzau, Schloss Schwarzau in Lower Austria. This was a little bit of an accomplishment, primarily because it is now a women's prison. And I can tell you, getting in was not as easy as it looks, although easier than getting out, I'm told. I mention this because, in a way, it almost reflects the difficulties that faced her and her family from top to bottom, beginning to end. I've thought many ways about how I would present this evening's tale to you, and I think I'll do it really as a tale because it deals with a certain amount of genealogy, but it is really, just as with her husband's life, like something out of the Middle Ages, like the days of Arthur and Charlemagne and Godefroy Bouillon But where her husband was a hero of that stature, you'll notice that with them, the ladies don't really come up all that much. Zita, on the other hand, she was definitely a force of nature. It's not too much, in a certain sense, to compare her to someone like Joan of Arc or Isabella of Spain, Isabella being her ancestress. And you'll understand why I'm saying this in due course. So first and foremost, who was Zita of Bourbon-Parma? Well, she was, above all, to begin with, a princess of Bourbon-Parma. Now, that doesn't mean anything to the average American. But the House of Bourbon has 5 major branches. The first, Bourbon of France, which was the original and is now extinct in the male line. And therein plays part of her story, actually. There's the Bourbon of Spain, who were founded by the grandson of Louis XIV after the War of Spanish Succession, which we Americans call Queen Anne's War. You see, I can't go into all the innumerable details I would love to go into, but suffice to say that American history is usually studied in isolation from European, and that distorts it tremendously. And so that's, just bear that in mind. We say World War I and World War II, but there were about 6 or 7 world wars in the age of sail, of which our revolution was one. But never mind, put that aside. So you have the Bourbon of Spain, the Bourbon. You have the Bourbon of Parma and the Bourbon of Two Sicilies, when separate lines of the house became Dukes of Parma and Kings of the Two Sicilies. Both of them being founded by the man who did the most important thing in the history of the world that any monarch has ever accomplished. The most extraordinary thing. Carlos III of Spain, the first of Parma, the second, I think, of Naples. He was all those things successively. First Duke of Parma under the Bourbon, first King of the Two Sicilies, King of Spain. What did he do that was so great? He founded Los Angeles, California. It's true. He ordered it built. He looked at the map. He pointed, said, I want a town there. And so it came to be. So you'll be happy to know that our Zita was the direct descendant of the founder of Los Angeles. That in itself should give her story more importance than anything else. You know, it's funny, this doesn't work on an Eastern crowd. I don't know why. You guys just look at me. Well, never mind. We'll move along. So the thing was that by the year of our Lord, 1815, Napoleon's genie was put back in the bottle. He was banished to St. Helena. The revolution seemed to be over, and there emerged a period of history that we call the Restoration. Now, why is this important? Well, it's because long before Zita's birth and long before Karl's, the pieces were being put on the board that would determine the course of their lives. Of course, that's true of all of us, actually. And that's another thing to think about when you're studying these things and you're reading about these folks' lives. It's also true for all of us. We are where we are because of things that happened long before we were born and with which we had nothing to do. Anyway, the monarchy was restored in France. And 15 years later, there was a revolution spearheaded by the King Charles X, his name was, his rather nasty cousin, Louis Philippe. That's the 5th branch of the House of Bourbon, Bourbon d'Orléans. Louis Philippe, the less said, the better. But when he deposed his cousin, Charles X, Charles and his family went to exile in Scotland. Now, Charles had 2 sons. The oldest, the Duc d'Angoulême, had no children. The second, the Duc de Berry, well, his wife had had a daughter. She was pregnant, and he was murdered. And there's no heir to the throne of France. The whole country held its breath to see what the baby would be who was born. When the baby was born, it was a son. and France rejoiced. That son, called the miracle child, the Dieudonné, his name was Henri, and he was called the Comte de Chambord because the people of France took up a collection and bought him a chateau. They were so excited. And that Chateau Chambord you can see today. It also enters into our story slightly. So the Comte de Chambord was the grandson of the king and the heir to the king and his remaining son. You have the revolution, the whole family goes into exile. Now, Chambord's mother was another Bourbon, but she was the Bourbon of the Two Sicilies. And she was kind of a fiery lady, was the Duchesse de Berry. So after 2 years of sitting in Scotland, not that sitting in Scotland will do this to you, but she got impatient. We've done nothing. My son's throne, because his grandfather and uncle had abdicated by this time in his favor. So de jure, he was Henry V, Henri V of France. She got just sick and tired of sitting there in Edinburgh waiting for something to happen. So she decided she would go back to her hometown of Naples, the one in Italy, not Florida, in case the retirees among us were wondering. And she gets back to Naples, Italy. She raises money, she raises arms, she gets people together to descend upon France and lead a counter-revolution in favor of her son. But something else happened while she was there, something totally unexpected. She fell in love with a Neapolitan nobleman and married him secretly in Rome. And then she said goodbye to him, goodbye to her parents, and headed off for France. There was a bright revolution that lasted for a little while and was quickly suppressed. She was arrested and thrown in prison by the ever-chivalrous Louis Philippe. And there she sat until it turned out she was pregnant. So she was released, and Louis Philippe laughingly said, "Have a nice life." Because everybody thought the child was illegitimate, and her ability to do anything for her son's cause was destroyed. This is a very important story, I think, and you'll find out why momentarily. So she goes back to Austria, where Charles X and the family, including her son, are now living. Initially, Charles X doesn't want to see his daughter-in-law because he thinks with everyone else that this is an illegitimate kid she's carrying. But she produces the documents and the husband. And he says, "Oh, gee, well, great. Welcome back to the family." And in fact, they have descendants to this day living in Austria. I've gotten the chance to meet some of them. But she was destroyed as far as being able to stand up for Chambord's cause. And that cause went on for quite a long time, into the 1860s and 70s. And had ups and downs. There was one moment when it looked very as though he was going to be restored in 1872 and 1873. Then occurred, again, this really isn't that germane, but he would not accept the terms under which they would have made him king. And people from that day to this have debated whether or not he did the right thing. But suffice to say, he didn't want to be the King of England. If he couldn't defend his people from their politicians, to use the phrase of a later monarch, he didn't want to bother. And of course, no politician wants a king who can defend the people from him. That's really not what politicians are about. Well, I mean, it's like having milk cows. You know, you don't want anybody to stop you from milking them, now do you? That's not why you've got cows. It's not why politicians have people. Anyway, never mind, let's move along. So the thing was that the Chambord had a sister, as I mentioned. She married the Duke of Parma, who died early and left a son named Robert. Robert's very important. In 1859, the little duchy was invaded by the Sardinians, and the young duke and his mother had to move off, and so they did. And they moved to Austria and moved in with her brother. The Comte de Chambord became young Robert of Parma's surrogate father in a lot of ways. Why is this important? because Robert of Parma married twice. He married another Bourbon of the Two Sicilies, and then he married Zita's mother, a Braganza princess from Portugal. And Robert became the father of Zita, his second wife, the mother. Why have I taken all the time with the Duchesse de Berry? Because I have come to think from my researches that story had a big effect on her. I'll explain why, as I say, momentarily. But let's look at Robert, Duke of Parma. Now, he was, as I've said, pushed out of Parma, but he was an extremely wealthy man nevertheless. When his uncle died, he left him the Chateau of Chambord in France. He had Castle Schwarzau in Austria. He had possessions in Switzerland. He was a very wealthy man. He just wasn't a sovereign. I mean, he was a royal by blood. His children were marriageable by other royals, but he ruled no territory. He ended up having 12 children by each of his wives, 24 in all. That was a big family. And the thing was that the older set had several of them had what we would say today in our more enlightened age, they had learning disabilities. They had other words for it when I was growing up. Politicians, no, we didn't say that then. We might say it now, but not then. Anyway, I've got to watch myself, ladies and gentlemen. It's easy for me to derail myself. But at any rate, so the children of the younger set were taught to treat the children of the older set with complete equality. And their mother treated the older children as though they were her own by blood. It was all 24 traveled together across Europe. Every year they make this annual pilgrimage from, Zita was born in Pianore, which was a house in, it's difficult to explain. I'd have to go on and on about the details, but suffice to say, Robert lost everything he'd owned in Parma, but not what he'd owned elsewhere in Italy, because that he owned as a private citizen. So to put this another way, what he owned in Italy as Duke of Parma was seized by the Italian state. What he owned as a private citizen, they left alone. So in Pianore, which was a villa in the town of Lucca, his daughter Zita was born. So this multi-family, this gigantic clan, moved across Central Europe in a regular schedule. They had cousins of all nationalities. They were very multilingual, multicultural. And I must believe that the story of the Duchesse de Parma, or de Berry, was a frequent topic of conversation. So, I've told you they were marriageable. I will leave Zita and her traveling family alone for a little bit. They're going back and forth between Austria and France and Austria, before the First World War. Meanwhile, in Austria, their hosts were the illustrious House of Habsburg. Now, probably, I would say, if there are two houses that are virtually equal in antiquity and grandeur, etc., they are the houses of Habsburg and Bourbon. They haven't had too many marriages between them, but those that they have had have been fairly amazing. Louis XIII of France married Anne of Austria and d'Autriche, and their son was Louis XIV. But Anne of Austria, amongst other things, promoted devotion to her patron saint, St. Anne, and actually funded the building in the then French colony of Quebec of St. Anne de Beaupré. So if you ever go on pilgrimage to St. Anne de Beaupré, you can thank Anne of Austria. A second major, despite the connections, France and the Habsburgs had opposed each other for several hundred years, starting back in the 1550s, when King Francis II of France didn't win the election for Holy Roman Emperor against Charles V. So that enmity had seen the French backing the Protestants and the Turks against the Habsburgs. It was a very unpleasant history. But all that was sealed with a bow in 1756, when the Dauphin of France, the heir to the throne, married Maria Antonia, the daughter of the Holy Roman Empress Maria Theresia. Maria Antonia, of course, became famous in history as Marie Antoinette, and the anniversary of her murder was just a day or two ago. The Dauphin became Louis XVI. Well, then, of course, we had the Revolution, the Restoration I spoke of. We know all about that. The Habsburgs, in the meantime, having ruled at one point an empire upon which the sun never set, under Charles V, when they had Mexico and Peru and Spain and the Holy Roman Empire and Naples and Belgium and Florida. Remember, the Habsburgs founded the first permanent European settlement in the United States, St. Augustine, under Pedro II. During the 19th century, this is just by the by, they poured thousands of, well, now we'll say thousands of dollars into the Catholic Church of the United States, founded 400 parishes. It's something we don't remember. You know, we Americans have tons and tons of virtues, lots of them, and we don't mind telling the world about them. But the one we sometimes lack is gratitude. At any rate, all that was going on. Austria was acting as the bulwark of the church during first the Counter-Reformation, then the French Revolution, the period after. And in the period of the 19th century, when the great liberal revolutions were taking place, the Habsburgs stood as the champions of conservative monarchy and of the Catholic Church. In the year 1848, revolution threatened the Habsburg monarchy in a way it hadn't been threatened since Napoleon camped out at Schönbrunn. So the then emperor, Ferdinand, was induced to abdicate because he wasn't considered to be sufficient to deal with the issue. And a 19-year-old boy took the destinies of the house into his hands. That boy was named Franz Josef. We think of him as this old mutton-chopped fellow, which he was later on. But he became Emperor of Austria in a terrible time. He managed, through appointing the right people to the right jobs, to rescue the empire. The revolution was put down, and now Austria had to face a whole new world. He had a very tragic life. His brother Maximilian was summoned by the Mexican conservatives to be Emperor of Mexico, and he ended up being murdered by Benito Juarez. I don't want to say too much about Maximilian, except to say that his two top generals, Mejia and Miramon, were offered the chance to have their lives spared if they would forswear their allegiance to him. They refused and were shot with him. And it does take some sort of a character to attract that kind of loyalty. At any rate, so Maximilian dies in 1867. Franz Josef marries a lady named Elizabeth, Sisi. You've heard of her, I'm sure. She was known as nodding. Who? Elizabeth? Wasn't that the Queen of Great Britain? Didn't she just die? No, not the same person. Sisi was in the 19th century, a long time ago. But she was, in a sense, and some will take umbrage at my describing her this way, but in a way she was sort of the Princess Diana of the 19th century. She was beautiful, she was brilliant, she was a bit unstable, and it was a love match. You know, Franz Josef was supposed to marry her older sister, fell for her, they got married. They had several daughters, some of whom have descendants today, and they had a son, Rudolph. Now, in addition to the dead Maximilian, and in addition, well, he had several other brothers, but the next brother was Karl Theodor, I think. Is that right? It doesn't matter. Because, well, I mean, it does, and obviously to them. But Karl Theodor, in turn, had two sons, the very handsome Otto and the somewhat more, what's that? Karl Ludwig, yeah, thank you. That was it. Every time I go to Mass, I see the house that he owned with the big golden ball on it. Karl Ludwig, yes. And Karl Ludwig had two sons. Otto was the younger one. The older one was Franz Ferdinand, who had very bad health initially, and at times wasn't expected to live. So this is where we are in 1885, I guess, 1886. For an historian, I'm bad at dates, but I'm not going to look at my computer. I'd look even worse. So I'll just try to finesse it. So Otto, in turn, has married a Saxon princess, and they have produced two sons, the older of whom is Karl. So now, we're in 1885, 1887. All right. So what do we got? Franz Joseph is the emperor. His heir is his son Rudolf. If something should happen to Rudolf, there's his brother, Karl Ludwig. Karl Ludwig has an older son, Franz Ferdinand, younger son Otto, and then Karl. So the likelihood of Karl becoming emperor is minimal. But a couple of things happen. Rudolf has problems with his father. He's married to a Belgian princess with whom he doesn't really get along. They have a daughter. Rudolf has a lot of interesting, if unsuitable, friends. There's a great deal of mystery about what happens to him at the end. I've told you that Princess Diana was Sisi was the Princess Diana of the 19th century. Rudolf and his mistress die mysteriously at Meyerling, and that was the Kennedy assassination of the 19th century. To this day, there's a great deal of speculation and discord as to whether it was murder or suicide. When I was doing the research on my Karl book, Zita, who we'll get to in a minute, Zita was sure that it was murder. The official story was that it was suicide. The monks at Heiligenkreuz Abbey who received the bodies assured me that when they got the body, mind you, this is by tradition, the monks who received the body were all dead. No, really, they are. And no, I didn't go to interview them immediately after either, just so, we get that straight. But the monks at Heiligenkreuz have maintained from that day to this that Rudolph's fingers were broken. Now, if that's true, then there's no way it was suicide. But that, I've spoken to the head of the house about this issue, and you could solve it quickly enough by opening up and looking, but who would that help? If it turns out that that the fingers are intact and it was suicide, it's a lot of effort about nothing. And if it was murder, it opens up a huge can of worms. And actually, the Habsburgs today are doing other things. The last thing I think any of them need is Meyerling being drawn up again and again and again. But it's worth keeping in mind because Zita had definite opinions about it that differed from those of other people. And we'll move along. So Rudolf has this strange death. In 1898, and incidentally, Karl Ludwig becomes the heir to the throne with Rudolf's death. 1898, Elizabeth is stabbed to death on a ferry in Lake Geneva. So his brother is gone, his son is gone, now his wife is murdered. His brother, Karl Ludwig, was a very devout man who went to the Holy Land and drank from the River Jordan. This was probably very pious, but it's probably unwise because it killed him. It took a while, but it killed him. So that leaves us with Franz Ferdinand and Otto, rather. Franz Ferdinand, at this point, has very bad health, and he's not expected to necessarily live, but he does. And he becomes a very athletic man, a great hunter and all that. And he may very well marry and have heirs, so still it doesn't look like Karl is going to get anywhere necessarily. Years go by, and Franz Ferdinand falls in love with the wrong person. He falls in love with the Countess Kotek, and he is going to marry her. It's that simple. The emperor is not happy with his nephew's choice, but he finally says, all right, you can marry her, but you must agree that your children will never sit on the throne. He agreed. And the result was the Dukes of Hohenberg, who are still with us, thankfully. And they're the direct descendants of Franz Ferdinand. But they are not Habsburgs. And they're not heirs. Otto, in the meantime, his marriage crumbled. He was a very pleasant, enjoyable fellow, but he died of syphilis. We'll leave it at that. He and his wife separated, and young Karl ended up becoming, in many ways, the ward of his uncle Franz Ferdinand. And there you see the real measure of Franz Ferdinand, because it would have been so easy in his situation like his to have hated his nephew. But he loved him. He mentored him. It was just like a second father. And in return, both Karl's married life, I mean, his own parents' married life was nothing to look at, and forget about Franz Josef's. But in his uncle and his aunt, Sophie, he saw a devoted couple who lived the faith together, who loved their children together, and that would be his vision of what a married life should be. But he had to have a suitable wife. Franz Josef was deathly afraid that Karl would find someone unsuitable. But his old playmate, because they'd known each other as children, Zita, caught his attention. And these two married. Their courtship was rather rapid. He was afraid that a cousin of hers, the head of the Carlist branch of the Spanish Bourbons, would marry her. And he heard the rumor that he'd already proposed. So it was dispelled, but he told his aunt, who was the one who told him, and said, well, I better marry her before anybody else does. So he proposes to her during a hunting trip. They get married on October the 21st, 1911. This was a huge affair at Castle Schwarzau. It's one of the few times you see pictures of Franz Josef smiling, because he was happy as happy could be. His new great niece-in-law was a very bright lady. She already had acquired a reputation for being solid. She had been educated in England and in Switzerland and elsewhere. She spoke several languages. Her father was dead by this time, but he had been a very, very solid fellow. I mean, in every way imaginable from Franz Josef's point of view, she was a tremendous catch. And it was a love match. So you put it all together, what's not to like? Little did they know what the next 10 years would bring. Now, a couple of other points I have to make, which are pretty germane. Many people have argued over who was responsible for the outbreak of World War I. In a certain sense, it's kind of an endless quest, because every country in Europe had what you might call a war party and a peace party. The war party, and again, I'm wildly generalizing, and there were differences from country to country and so on and so forth, but basically every country in Europe had internal pressures of different kinds, social, cultural, industrial, etc. And inevitably, the given war party saw an external war as a way out of the internal issues, pulling everybody together around the glorious flag, whichever flag that was. Several key things happened before 1914. In 1905, Tsar Nicholas II and Kaiser Wilhelm II went on a cruise in the Baltic together. They were first cousins and very good friends. They signed a peace treaty, an alliance between them. They got home to their respective capitals, and both their governments refused to accept it. That showed you that by that time, the power in Russia and Germany was not in the hands of the Kaiser or the Tsar. In 1914, this unfortunate episode would be repeated when the two of them carried on a correspondence trying to cut off the war, the famous Nicky Willie letters. And they're very sad to read because you get from both of them, reading between the lines, that they're not in a position to stop anything. That was one thing. Then, if that wasn't bad enough, in 1912, Pyotr Stolypin, the Russian prime minister, was assassinated. He had been the leader of Russia's peace party. The leader of the peace party in Austria-Hungary was Franz Ferdinand. And had he become emperor, things might have been very, very different. And certainly Karl would have had a much different life. Franz Joseph did not get along at all well with Franz Ferdinand, and so he sort of kept him out of decision-making and so on. But Franz Ferdinand declared, if when I become emperor, I'll bring Karl to work with me every day, and I'll show him how it's done. That would have been a tremendous gift for our Karl. Incidentally, around Franz Ferdinand and his set developed a sort of center of influence to counterbalance Franz Josef's at the Hofburg. Karl was in a position, Karl and Zita, to have set up yet a third one, but they didn't do it. Instead, they stayed on good terms with both Franz Josef and Franz Ferdinand. And I've often thought the reason why they were able to manage that was because Karl was used to balancing the difficulties between his parents. There are many things you can look to him as a patron of: rulers, soldiers, husbands, fathers, but also, I think, children of broken or bad homes, because he got the best out of both of his parents without taking on their worst qualities. And that, what else can you do if you come from that kind of a family? And he loved them both, despite their failings. Anyway, so life burbles on for a couple of years after the wedding. The international situation becomes increasingly tense. And then Franz Ferdinand has Karl and Zita to dinner with his wife. Sophie goes out of the room, and he says, while your aunt is away at the moment, I need to tell you something. I believe they're going to murder me, but I have some papers I want you to see. And he pointed out where they were. Don't say anything to your aunt when she comes back. And they didn't. And then a few months later came the famous trip to Sarajevo, and he and Sophie were killed, and the war began. Now, Karl had been trained as a soldier, and he had a soldier's dislike of pointless wars. Franz Josef was not happy with the way things went. He wasn't keen on the war because, unlike his ministers, he'd actually been in combat. But hotter heads prevailed throughout Europe. It's 110 years ago, and the shadow of that horrible conflict is still over us. Those of us who are somewhat older, my granduncles and my grandfather were all in the First War, and they told stories. If you're of a certain age, you've got a conscious memory of it. Not as conscious as World War II, if you're my age, but conscious enough. When I was a kid, almost everybody's grandfather had been in World War I, and everybody's dad had been in World War II, unless they were young, and they'd been to Korea. And your older brother went to Vietnam. So it was a fun time. But at any rate, it's a little bit different now because this is over a century ago and it seems like ancient history. But I assure you that the world we live in now was formed by the events of that time. So the war goes on. Austria-Hungary becomes increasingly subject to its German ally. Kaiser Wilhelm had completely lost control of Germany to the two generals, Hindenburg and Ludendorff. And they, in turn, as the war dragged on, began to look for easy ways out. are those easy ways out eventually sign their own death warrants. Unconditional submarine warfare, gas, things like that. 1916, well, while I should have mentioned that Franz Josef used Karl as his eyes and ears at the front. And he would go here, go there, go the other place, reporting on things, and occasionally taking command of units. So they called him Karl the Sudden, because they never knew when he'd appear. And then he'd go back, he'd report to Franz Josef what he had seen, and then he was off to another front. So he saw service against the Italians, against the Russians, and latterly against the Romanians. Zita, when she wasn't doing war work in Vienna, would come with him on these travels. And there was a very famous incident in Transylvania where she went to see the POWs, the Romanian POWs in the hospital, and shocked them by speaking perfect Romanian, which they really were not looking for. At any rate, moving along, Franz Josef dies, Karl and Zita become emperor and empress. The Hungarian prime minister, Count Tisza, insists that they get crowned king and queen of Hungary right away. The reason for this was that he knew that Karl was very much in favor of Franz Ferdinand's plan to federalize the empire, which meant the Slovaks, the Romanians, the Croats, etc., would have their own piece of the pie, as it were. And that was something the Hungarian Liberal Party was very much against, Tisza's party. The Hungarian Catholic conservatives were a whole other bunch, but they weren't in power. So, what happens? It's intimated that unless they want Hungary to cut off grain to the Austrian half of the empire, he better get crowned quick. So he is. And on December the 30th, 1916, he's crowned. Now, one thing about Karl that I have not touched on is that he was a man of his word. When, as a teenager, he was going to be brought into the Order of the Golden Fleece, he insisted that the statutes of the order be translated out of Old Burgundian French so he could assure himself that he could live up to them. He took his marriage vows the same way. When he and Zita had gotten married, he said to her, "Now we must begin to help each other get to heaven." And then, when he was going to be crowned, as Zita reported later, he studied the texts of the coronation liturgy very carefully. In a lot of ways, the coronation rite that you saw a couple of years ago with King Charles was similar, because it came from the same sources. The coronation rite they use in Britain today is an Anglicanized version of the medieval Catholic coronation rite, which was where the Hungarian rite came from. They're very similar. So it took the same sorts of oaths and so on to maintain the law, to protect the people and so forth. So this coronation in 1916, in a lot of ways, determined the future course of their lives, because they both felt bound not just to the Hungarians, but to all of their peoples by the oaths they had taken. They had to live their lives for their peoples first. And this would pretty much ensure that neither of them would have what we call a conventionally happy life from that point on. So Karl is emperor, he's king, she's empress and queen. Their relationship was very interesting. People were very often struck by her more than him. She was very animated. She was very forceful. But in looking at the record, you might say, it came to me that really he was the one who determined policy. But she would try to figure out how to make it happen. And that's really the key to their relationship. They were of one mind, but they brought very differing strengths to the relationship. She was very practical, very pragmatic, very, what's the word I want? She would see things through. He had the great ideas. And she would remain true to those ideas till the day she died. That's another thing to remember about Zita. Karl, didn't live long. He was young, he was handsome, he was a bright star that went like a comet across the firmament. Zita was left year after year after year to try to keep that light he lit going. Well, from that time, for the rest of the war, really, the 2 years remaining to them, they sought peace. And they used her brothers as the medium of dealing with the Allies. Why? Because her two brothers were in the Belgian army. They had attempted to go into the French army, but because they were descendants of the Royal House of France, they were refused. That being the delicate law in place at that time. So they did the next best thing, and they went to work under King Albert of the Belgians. They joined the Belgian army. The rest of those 2 years, as I say, was spent trying every way possible to seek peace. In my researches, I found something interesting. His was not the only attempt at peace. Victor Emmanuel III attempted it through directly. King Albert of the Belgians attempted it. And no one was interested in the efforts of any of the three. But what did these three monarchs have in common that the other leadership did not have? They were at the front. They were there. Interestingly enough, another man who was formed by his experiences was the Duke of Windsor, who, as Prince of Wales, saw his chauffeur killed right in front of him at the front. And later on, for some reason, the idea of another war in Europe didn't really excite him either. War's a funny thing. People who actually experience it generally are not really keen on repeating it. Those who don't, but are in a position to move people like chess pieces, they think it's a lot of fun. Isn't that strange? My dad was the tail gunner in the Second War against the Japanese. And he used to say there's no pacifist like a soldier. And I think there's a lot of truth to it. Anyway, moving along, what should happen? None of this worked. As we know, Woodrow Wilson, in the end, insisted that the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns be deposed. Without wanting to belabor that point too much, I'll just quote Winston Churchill, who said that it was Wilson's insistence on disposing of the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns, the Wittelsbachs, and the rest that allowed, in his words, the Hitlerite monster to crawl out of the sewer and then open the door for Stalin. That was Woodrow Wilson's doing. And it's something we can be proud of, I'm sure. Anyway, they were forced into exile, as we know. And there's a very, again, I don't want to go on too long if I can avoid it, but there's a very, very touching scene. Their son, their oldest son, the Archduke Otto, whom I had the honor of knowing, he was asked one day what he thought about the English. And he said, well, it would be easy for me to hate them. But then there was Strutt. And Strutt, in this case, was a Colonel Strutt. When they were forced out of power, they were living in a little place called Eckartsau, near the Hungarian and now Slovak borders. And this was a hunting lodge out in the middle of nowhere. It's still kind of rural. They were in a very, very precarious position. Karl Renner, who had taken control of Austria, a man who managed to betray his country 3 times and die president. You got to give him marks for resourcefulness. To be able to sell out first to Hitler and then Stalin. That's and he's considered a hero today. I guess tells you if you can consider a man like that a hero, you got something going. I guess I don't know what, but Renner made their position ever more precarious, and Karl began to fear for their personal safety. So he sent a direct letter to King George V. And George V, feeling rather guilty over the murder of his Romanov relatives the year before, and without the assistance of his government, sent Colonel Strutt, an English adventurer, a Catholic, and a An amazing man. Strutt shows up at the door basically and sets everything to rights and arranges for their safe withdrawal to Switzerland. In Switzerland, they continue to have an effect over the peace treaty, actually, over the negotiations. There's a book I recommend very highly called Forbidden Federalism, which deals with all sorts of recently opened files and so on, and points out the influence that the House continued to wield from Switzerland over the peace process. It's one of the things, for instance, that got the Allies to insist on no Anschluss between Austria and Germany, which Renner, of course, was very much in favor of. Well, I don't want to keep bagging on Renner, but he's such a fun target. When you're that much of a moron, it's hard not to throw rocks. I'm sorry. Anyway, a dishonest moron. Anyway, let's move along. So, what should happen? But that they were very much aware of what was going on in Hungary. There was a terrible communist takeover in Hungary. A man named Bela Kun, Countessa, who had been one of Karl's nemesis, was murdered under the Kun regime. It was a terrible thing. Then that, in turn, was overthrown in a counter-revolution led by a man who had sworn lifelong loyalty to Karl, Admiral Horthy, the admiral on horseback. He was an interesting fellow all on his own, but he had been the ADC to Karl at the wedding. And when Karl was being forced out of government, he came and with tears pouring vowed that he would do anything, even to give up his life, to get Karl back on the throne. Well, in 1921, Karl attempted to have him make good on that. Again, I can't go into the wonderful details, but suffice to say that the first of the two attempts he made to regain the throne, he went by himself. And it was like the prisoner of Zenda. He gets on the Orient Express. Oh, there are all these code names, masks, everything you'd see in a Nero Wolfe novel. It all happens. He finally gets to Budapest. He has an interview with Horthy, and Horthy basically says, "What will you give me?" I ain't giving you enough. No, he didn't say that. But it was very clear that Horthy was quite happy to run the country and was not going to keep his promises. So back he goes to Switzerland. He tries a second time, and this time Zita comes with him, and she's pregnant. So the two of them ride in an airplane for the first time in their lives. They land, they gather an army, they march on Budapest. Again, the imp of the perverse that dogged them through this whole story struck again. They had a very, very loyal, wonderful officer named Colonel Lehar, brother to the famous composer, who served them through thick and thin, but insisted on this other chap, whose name I can never remember, being senior to him, should be the commander. And Karl wasn't sure this was a good idea, but Lehar insisted. He's my superior, he's a wonderful man, blah, blah, blah. He betrayed him. And the result was another defeat. Well, this time, they weren't going to be allowed to go back to Switzerland. So they were stuck at a little monastery in a lake, Lake Balaton, Tihani it's called, while the Allies tried to figure out what to do with them. Now, I should emphasize at this point that the only reason why they tried these two things was that the French foreign minister and then Prime Minister Briand assured Karl, if he succeeded, we'll back you against the surrounding countries. Of course, if you fail, you're on your own. But they were willing to do it, again, because of the oaths. They had a very comfortable life in Switzerland. They really didn't have to do this. They could have just relaxed and enjoyed themselves for the rest of their lives. But they couldn't do it. So they ended up being put on a boat that took them down the Danube to Galatz in Romania, and then put on a ship that took them all the way out to Madeira. The children were, thank God, brought to them from Switzerland, and they were reunited. But the Allies said, not a penny shall you have, not from your supporters, not from anyone, unless you renounce the throne for yourselves and your children. This they would not do. And so they had no money. They were lent a house up in the hills, and I went there 2 years ago. I could see why I had problems. He had gotten, the flu in 1918, and that and a couple of other misadventures had wrecked his lungs. So he's up in this terrarium, dripping wet. I mean, as I say, when I went there, because it was the anniversary of the death, it was April 1st, I could see why she couldn't keep him alive. She tried, but once the pneumonia set in, it was impossible. There was no money for decent food. There was no money for decent medicine. They had to drag oxygen up that hill. It was a very steep hill. It was a really horrible thing. But several things happened when he was on his deathbed. The one, he said to her, I am dying, I am suffering, that my peoples might come back together. That was the day he died. He also told her the day he died, I have spoken to the King of Spain. As soon as I'm gone, contact him, he'll take care of you. And she said, you couldn't have spoken to the King of Spain. It's not possible. So just do as I say. And then he had a very affecting death scene. Otto was brought in to see him die. He said, I sure want this. He said, I want him to see how an emperor and a Catholic dies. And so he did. Interestingly enough, in later years, Otto would say that the happiest times of his life were the times in exile. Not the death, of course, but the time in Switzerland and the early portion of Madeira, because he was very little when the war broke out, and during the war, he barely got to see his parents. But that time together as a family in Switzerland and in Madeira was very, very precious to him, the memory of it, the memory of his father. Anyway, so his father dies, he's buried, and Zita is now in a terrible position. She's pregnant with her 8th child. He's dead. And this is where I come back to the story of the Duchesse de Berry. Because, and I can't prove this, she was a very private woman. She did not confide in people. You could know her to a point, but no further. But I suspect that finding herself in just the same position as her ancestors, she resolved she was not going to do that. She would not put her own happiness over her son's cause. And the rest of her life, she lived for the future of the House of Habsburg, its restoration, and the reconstitution of Central Europe as a federation. The same vision of Franz Ferdinand, the same vision Karl had had alive, that was the vision of Zita, and it was the vision of her son, so long as it was possible to achieve it in terms of practical politics. Well, she appeals to the King of Spain, and to her surprise, he says, I'm sending a battleship to pick you up. And the Allies get very upset, and their little hands flutter, and their little feet stamp. And they say, oh no, you mustn't. And Lloyd George says, why, if you try to pick them up without their renouncing the throne, why, I'll fire on them. And the king said, if you fire on my battleship, you'll be at war with Spain. Now, that might seem like a small threat, but remember that the British public were bled white, and they backed down from a fight with Turkey earlier in the year. So there was no way this was going to happen. The Santa Isabella comes into the port, picks them up, takes them back to Spain. They arrive in Cadiz, they get on the train, they go all the way to Madrid, they see the king. And she says, I appreciate you doing this, but why? He said, well, I'll tell you, the day they told me your husband was dying, I suddenly had this peculiar feeling that if I didn't take care of you and the children afterwards, the same thing would happen to my own wife and children. And then she told him what Karl had said, and they kind of rolled their eyes at each other. What do you say, you know? Well, for the next few years, they lived in the north of Spain while she set up their education. And it was, especially for Otto, a very rigorous one. They spoke a different language every day in Rota. She went to Mass twice a day, sometimes 3. And from that time on, from the time her husband died, she wore black. She wore black for the rest of her life. There was never any question of her remarrying. She was purely and completely dedicated to the faith and to her son's cause. And so things went for 10 years. In less than that, 1928, I guess, they were there for 6 years. They moved to Belgium so that Otto could go to school at Louvain. And they settled down in the Chateau of Ham, which, despite its delicious-sounding name, was made of cold stone. Now, there they were while Otto grew up. In 1930, they had a big ceremony, his coming-of-age ceremony. And at this point, there's a very strong monarchist movement in each of the former countries in Central Europe, especially Austria and Hungary. But the Allies are dead set against it. Horthy is dead set against it. Masaryk in Czechoslovakia is dead set against it. Just a funny little note about that, though. Thomas Masaryk was obviously very anti-Habsburg, but his son was a Jan Masaryk, who would later be helped out a window by the communists in 1948. Jan Masaryk stayed loyal to the emperor to the end. And he was also a great pianist. So one day when his father was president of Czechoslovakia, there was this big diplomatic reception at Radkany Castle in Prague. And Jan Masaryk was asked by his father to play something. So he played the Kaiser hymn. You wanted it, Pops? You got it. And there were a lot of people like that scattered throughout the former empire. It's just that they weren't the people in charge. Well, long and the short of it, because Otto wanted to find out who this Hitler chap was, in 1932, he went to Berlin to study agriculture under a renowned Catholic agronomist. That was the ostensible reason. But he had read Mein Kampf. Now, Adolf Hitler hated the Habsburgs a lot. Not a little, a lot. And this hatred came for 2 reasons. He had been a poor artist. He was a bad artist, but he was poor in Vienna. And he was working at one of Vienna's hotels. I forget if it was the Sacher or the Imperial. It was one or the other. And he saw young Karl coming out of a ball. And he conceived an instant hatred for him. Absolutely couldn't abide him. So that hatred you'll read about in Mein Kampf, if you read it. He couldn't stand them. Well, Otto read Mein Kampf. And he said, well, what is this going to mean with this man in charge of Germany? Because the Archduke Otto, he was an amazing individual, and his education had been amazing. And he was very perspicacious in a lot of ways, more than a lot of his elders. So he watches what's going on in Berlin with increasing horror. Hitler wanted to talk to him, but that was the one man he wouldn't talk to. And he said in later years, I've generally never refused an invitation to what I thought would be an interesting conversation. But to this day, I think that's the only one I would not deal with. And then Hitler comes to power in at the end of 32, the beginning of 33 rather, January 33, and Otto hightails it out of Dodge. And it was a good thing he did, because he learned the Gestapo were hot on his trail. So he gets to Czechoslovakia and then comes circuitously back to Belgium. He was in touch with the anti-Hitler resistance, and they gave him a great many dossiers on Hitler's plans. He thinks, okay, what am I going to do with this information? Who do I give it to? So he gave it to our Ambassador Bullitt in Paris. And Ambassador Bullitt in turn sent it to FDR in Washington. FDR responded, well, you tell that young man if he ever needs a place to stay, he can come to the United States of America. He didn't say it like that because he had a much more patrician New York accent, but anyway. So, long story, almost to the end, I hope, maybe, if we get moving along. World War II breaks out. They invade, the Germans invade. The King Leopold III of the Belgians calls Zita and says, get them out of there. They're en route. And the castle gets bombed. So they hit the high road. And they have a very, very exciting trip that finally brings them down to the Spanish border. But as they're going through collapsing France, there are other Austrian refugees. And they're, oh my heavens, it's the Habsburgs. Let's join with them. And a lot of these were Jews. So by the time they got to the Spanish border, they had a ton of people with them. They had started out with 3 cars, and now they've come with a herd. And the question was, Franco had ordered the border closed, and they couldn't leave these people. What do you do? Thankfully, the fellow in charge of that stretch of the border had been in charge of the civil guard in the village in Spain where they lived. So he recognized them and said, well, come on through. And the whole kit and caboodle passed into Spain. So from there they went to Lisbon, and from there, Otto flew to Washington, and they took a ship, the rest of the family. She, in turn, initially they lived for a little while in Royalston, Massachusetts, and then eventually she went to Quebec because the younger boys went to Laval University. Charles de Koninck, who had taught Otto at Louvain, had gone to Laval. So she was very popular in Quebecois society. The French Canadians in those days were very monarchist, even as far as the British went. Well, having a Catholic empress, this was quite something for the people of Quebec. In Royalston, if you go there today, and in Tuxedo Park, where she also stayed at one point, the locals call the house that she stayed in the Empress's Palace. And you get the feeling, certainly in Royalston, that a good deal of her importance in history was because she'd been in Royalston. I'm not joking. You know, wasn't she lucky to have been in Royalston? You know, that probably the only empress in history who had the privilege of living here. But at any rate, so there she spent the war years. And by this time, her political star, as it were, began to fade. Otto and his brothers were becoming adult now. His younger brothers, as the war began to wind down. In the beginning, Roosevelt listened to him, and he was a real advisor. If you ever drink Verslauer mineral water, you can thank Archduke Otto, because he convinced Roosevelt that that was not a military target, and so it wasn't bombed. Verslauer was going to be bombed. The mineral water works. Every time I have a glass of Verslauer in Austria, I think, thank you very much, Your Imperial and Royal Highness. But his star began to be replaced by another individual, Uncle Joe Stalin, as Roosevelt called him. Too late for Churchill, who thought the young man knew what he was talking about. But as the war dragged on, Churchill had less and less say over anything. So in the end, the Soviet-American diarchy that would rule Europe from 1945 to 1991 began to be set in place. There's a lot of other things I could say about the story, and you know, I can't. I've got to bring it to an end, and that's just as well, because now after the war, after Zita's mother dies, well, she returns in 1950, and after Zita's mother dies, a long-lived family, she moves into a monastery in Switzerland, and she'll stay there herself until she dies in 1989. Her political side really came to an end, and she became almost a nun. Almost. She looked after her family. Several of her relatives, I had great need of her services during various family tragedies and so on, and she made herself available for that sort of thing. She had a bit of a dust-up with Otto in 1962 when he decided to renounce the throne of Austria in return for being allowed into the country, and that took 5 years to finally engineer, when he finally got in. She never renounced anything, and yet in 1983, I think, was able finally to re-enter Austria for the first time since 1919. And she became very popular the few years she had left. She was interviewed constantly. And everything changed. You know, when Karl died in exile in Madeira, she took his heart with her. The Habsburgs have a long history of burying the heart separately from the body. But she never thought that she would be buried in the Kaisergruft in Vienna. So what she did, originally the Habsburgs come from Aargau in Switzerland, where they were from the 900s until 1278 or 1250. Here I go with dates again. Anyway, when Rudolf took over Austria in the 1200s, in that period, their burial place, when they were just nobles in Aargau, was in a town called Muri, a monastery there. And so she had the interesting idea of setting that up as their new burial place. So she rededicated the Loretto Chapel. Karl's heart was placed there with the idea that she would eventually be buried there. But by the time she died, there was no question of that. Instead, she got a state funeral, the first since 1912 when Franz Josef had died. And this was an amazing thing for a lot of reasons. For one thing, communism was beginning to totter. And one of the signs of resistance in Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Yugoslavia, as they were then, was the creation of these reenactment units of military units of the old empire. This was actually illegal. And yet these units were formed, and many of their members came and played a part in the state funeral for Zita. Now, already, of course, she had lived to see her, and I didn't touch on this, but I should have. She had lived to see the cause open for the beatification of her son, of her husband. She had played a part in that, of course. She had gone to Madeira, and this became one of her big efforts as well, was the beatification. That must have been a tremendous vindication for her. When she met Pope John Paul II, who, as Father said in his sermon, was named after Karl. I think this is the only time in history a pope's created his own namesake. But, you know, it is what it is. He said, it's a wonderful thing to finally meet my Empress. You know, this was not bad stuff. So, I mean, she lived to see a partial vindication. When she died, as I say, this sort of movement of reenactment and so on spread into the former communist countries and played a role in what would happen in the next few months. Her son would sponsor the famous Pan-European picnic, which resulted in the smashing open of a part of the Iron Curtain and the coming of a whole bunch of East Germans through into the West. And by the end of 1989, Hungary was free. That in itself, you know, ladies and gentlemen, one wonders what would have happened if she had managed to live a bit longer and seen the result of it. But on the other hand, one also wonders if perhaps that collapse was not partly due to her intercession. I've taken a lot longer than I wanted to, but I'm sorry about that. I'll say, however, that writing the book was a greater challenge than writing Karl's book. Karl was, in a sense, easy. There's very little disagreement on anybody who really knows about him of his sanctity. But Zita lived a long time. She was a very strong woman because she had to be. You couldn't go through what she had gone through and keep the Habsburg ship of state afloat and not be very tough. No way around it. One individual who knew her said to me, on the one hand, I have no doubt that she's a saint. On the other hand, if you told me she ate iron filings for breakfast, I'd believe you. And this I can see, because she was toughest of all on herself. Again, this is the Duchesse de Berry, I think. She was tough on her oldest son, less so on the younger ones. Her grandchildren she adored. I think that's fair to say. Well, we only have one of the grandchildren here, but I think she can vouch for what I'm saying. I hope nothing I've said runs completely counter to what you remember. And so in writing the book, people saw her in different ways. And in writing the book, I had to come up with a narrative that would be as true to the facts as I could see them to be, and would square with what everybody remembered about her. And this was a very difficult thing for me to do. I couldn't write a hagiography because, of course, she's not a saint. She's a servant of God. What does that mean? It means it's the first step. The church has not infallibly declared that she's in heaven. There are not masses in honor of her. There are requiems for her. And I always feel odd going to a requiem for a servant of God, because it could be a saint. Maybe not, could be. So it's very strange. So it was very, very difficult. In the end, I think I did as good a job as anyone could. I was very gratified that the head of the house, the Archduke Karl, wrote a foreword to it, as he did for the first book. For various reasons, I was extremely happy about that. I would also say, when you read it, you'll find it's very different from the Karl book. I purposely put the Karl book aside. I didn't want to look at it. I just wanted to do something new. One of the things that led to was relying very heavily on the work of Dr. Elizabeth Kovacs for 4 chapters. Now, mind you, it's all attributed and so forth, but this ended up in a 6-month quest for the rights. And then I found out that the person who had the rights, after all, going all the way around to Houlan's barn, his office is right in the building I live in. I don't want to say I felt like a moron afterwards, but I felt like a moron afterwards. Oh, there was no way I could have known. But at any rate, ladies and gentlemen, it'll be coming out sometime soon to a theater near you. I would say that when you read the book, I'll say about her what I will say about Karl. Their lives seem like tragedies. They weren't. He's certainly in heaven, she quite possibly. And they did an awful lot of good at the time that they lived. She continued to do so till she died, a long time after. The tragedy of their lives is ours. And it's a funny thing. When I went to discuss with the Archduke Karl his writing a foreword for this book, it was 2022. And the Russians had been maneuvering around the Ukrainian border. I was absolutely sure they were not going to invade. He was absolutely sure they were. One of us was wrong, but I'm too modest to tell you which one. Suffice to say that now more than ever, we need the kind of leadership that they represent, a leadership that is willing to sacrifice itself for the benefit of its subjects. We're very used to being owned by people who don't mind pillaging us and sending us off to fight. But putting themselves in the firing line, that's a little foreign. That's a little strange. But we need that now. We need their intercession more than ever. We need their intercession for peace. When the war broke out, I first thought, especially because we haven't touched on this, but there's a whole sort of devotion to Kaiser Karl in Ukraine and Ruthenia and the eastern areas. But it seemed to me that for Orthodox to pray to their St. Nicholas II and us to pray to Blessed Karl for peace in that area would be a smart move. I can only end by saying that it has been an extraordinary journey these past several years, first writing about Karl and then writing about Zita. I'm now working on a book collecting the work of the Archduke Otto and his commentary on America. I can't tell you when that'll be finished because a lot of things are intervening. I had to come to Washington for one thing. No, it's not your fault. I don't blame you. But people ask me if you ever tire of writing about the Habsburgs. And my response, well, it could be worse. It could be writing about the Kennedys. So with that, I hesitate to say this, and I don't want to keep you any longer if I can avoid it, but for the next 10 minutes, 15, if there are any questions.
Charles, thank you so much for a marvelous, marvelous talk. Before we take questions and answers, just want to thank you. But I'm going to let you take a sip of water. But what I'd like, or coffee, but what I'd like is if it's possible, if Princess Maria Anna, who's the granddaughter of Zita and Karl, do you have a favorite memory of your grandmother? Or was there something is there a piece of advice that she passed along? Or is there something that you'd like to share about her before we take the questions and answers? It's a marvelous opportunity to speak to a grandchild of these two holy people. And so those of you have a special something to share.
Thank you. First, Charles, thank you. You stay.
Would you like the throat?
No, I don't. We hold it for a long time. You can have it. No, but thank you very much. I was sitting next to Lauren, and each time you said something, I was like, yes, that's true. Yes, that's true. Well done. One thing, but that we can discuss later. I don't go very much in your theory of Duchesse de Berry, but we can talk about it after. I want to say, and that will be perhaps attached to that my grandmother was obviously tremendously in love with her husband. Each time I spoke with her, and sadly I didn't speak enough about my grandfather because being young and 16 years old, I wasn't really interested in my grandfather, but my grandmother was there, so I asked her lots of questions about history, what was the thing that I really liked. But then she was, for instance, telling me about the trips on the honeymoon that she did over the whole empire, and all her face was so lit up because it was such a good memory, a loving memory of her husband. So, and from time to time, I wanted to say, Großmama, who from your grandchildren looks the most Großpapa? And she said, nobody. I was very, very, because he couldn't, she didn't see in nobody else the face of her husband. It was so much high. And that's why your theory of Duchesse de Berry, yes, of course, she wanted not to do the same mistake. But don't you think, just that's my idea, don't you think that her love for her husband was so great that she wanted to replace her husband in the education of her children, mostly of Otto. That's why she decided, above all, not to do this mistake and to follow her own happiness, but no, to educate her children, and mostly Otto, in the same way than her husband would have done it. And her idea was, whatever she does, she did it thinking, what would Karl do? And so that was always in her mind. And so that's just an idea for you. But you wrote already the book too late.
I agree. I'd absolutely agree. I mean, as I said earlier, he was definitely the man with the vision.
Yes, I like that.
And she was the one, she was practical, and she did her best to bring it about. And the way she did, I mean, I can't go into details, read the book, but she was so resourceful in terms of arranging things. Just one example, to teach them Hungarian, she got a monk brought over from Pannonhalma, which is, yeah. And I mean, she did all these sorts of things, taking them to Laval because de Koninck was there. You know, same.
She was in Belgium. Okay, I don't want it's late and somebody probably wants to ask questions. Thank you so much to be here in any case. Bravo you, bravo.
Thank you so much for being with us. Did Empress Zita have a favorite prayer?
She loved above all the Mother of God. And so when she died, very kindly our parents and aunts were giving each of us some little statue and something that was in her room. And I got even two Mother of Gods, two statues of Mother Gods of her. So her prayers were mostly the prayers for the Immaculate Heart of Mother.
Immaculate Heart, beautiful. Thank you so much. So now we'll take some questions here. So I'm going to give you back your throne.
Oh boy, I feel so excited now. I feel like a grown-up. It's great. Are there any questions?
Yes. Thank you so much for the talk. Are you, from your research, do you know that Blessed Karl spoke in person through some sort of emissary, or were you proposing that there was some kind of spiritual act by which the King of Spain simultaneously understood that he should take care of Zita after his death?
There was no emissary. There was nothing. I mean, that's why she was like, what? It was not possible for him to communicate with the King of Spain. It's just, there's no way.
But it's a
It
miracle.
was a miracle.
But he's quoted as saying, I have just spoken with.
That's what he said.
Wow.
So, and the intensity of the feeling on the king's part, so intense that he sent a battleship and risked war with Great Britain. That's not the kind of thing, I got this little sort of vague feeling. I don't know.
Right. Thank you.
So much. That was lovely. I was really intrigued by the relationship between Pope John Paul II and Karl and Zita, and I was wondering, if you could speak more about Zita's relationship to overthrowing communism, and if there were any resonances between JP2 and Solidarity and her work, and whether they communicated more besides that one meeting, and whether she ever spoke about JP2.
Well, they met, I think, 2 or 3 times, actually. They didn't, it wasn't just once. Most of what they said is not recorded, so I can't tell you what it was. I can tell you that she was always very much aware of the suffering of the people behind the Iron Curtain. That was never far from her mind. And when Otto went to Hungary for the first time, he managed to go there, I think, before she died. She wanted to know everything about it, everything he'd seen, what was going on. She, one of the things we tend to forget about monarchs is that they tend to look at their subjects as their children. The king is the father of his country, and the queen the mother. She had an extremely maternal heart. I mean, she could be tough, but she loved her peoples as much as he did, even though they were her adopted peoples. And there wasn't much she could do for them, except pray for them and suffer for them. It's interesting, again, that the beginning of the end of communism was sort of signaled by the formation of these reenactment units, again, in contravention of the law. And understand, this is Hungary, this is Czechoslovakia, this is Yugoslavia. The secret police are not pleasant people. you know. They're not fun. But the memory of the Habsburgs was growing, you know. And of course, today in those countries, it's undergone quite a resurgence. In Czechia, for instance, in Prague, 1918, Thomas Masaryk knocked down the Mariensäule, the Marian column, which commemorated the retaking of the city by the Habsburgs in 1618. He knocks it down as a symbol of victory over the Habsburg throne and the Catholic altar. They've just rebuilt it in 2020. They put it back up, and they're rebuilding the Radetzky Monument in Prague. I remember when I was a boy in Hollywood, there was an old Czech restaurant on Hollywood Boulevard called the Little Prague, and I went in there, and I was like 16, and this elderly Czech woman ran it. So I go in, and there's a big picture of Franz Josef on the wall. And I looked at that, and I said, I thought you Czechs were supposed to hate the Habsburgs. And she said, well, you know, we did, but we've had several alternatives since then. And, you know, none of them really worked out very well. So, you know, what can you say to that? But honestly, I have no doubt that her prayers had their effect. It struck me at the time that shortly after she died, the whole thing starts crumbling. I've never forgotten that. I mean, the connection hit me way back then, and all I could think was that her intercession brought about what her activity on earth could not. Of course, the Pope was very, very active in that, you know, in that whole thing. But I mean, it was a confluence of many things, and I've got to say too, not that it's important, but I am so grateful to God I lived to see the fall of the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain. You know, when I was in military college, we were all convinced we were going to die fighting the Soviets. I mean, I was as sure of that as I am that I'm flying back to Vienna in 2 days. Quite literally. And it made a certain kind of mentality, you know. If you really highly doubt you're going to see 25, it creates a kind of mindset. Well, obviously that didn't happen. And in 1993, I walked through the Brandenburg Gate and then drove back to Aachen through the Fulda Gap, where I thought I was going to die fighting the Soviets. And it hit me, of all the terrible things that could yet happen to me, not that one. To live, I mean, most of the people here are too young to realize what a wonderful thing it was to have that burden lifted off our shoulders. It was wonderful. And I mean, despite all the garbage and whatnot that's happened since, I'm thinking, thanks to God that we didn't go through that. No more duck and cover in schools. No more threat of nuclear annihilation. It was wonderful. And things have gone south in more ways than one since, but not that. So I'm grateful for that. And I partly blame Empress Zita. Any others? Going once? Going yes, Folly.
Sorry if I can take one more forward from you. You mentioned obviously her holiness of life and her love for her children and grandchildren, and how she attended the celebration of Mass at least twice a day. I wondered if there were any writings from her or from Blessed Karl to her family about the Blessed Sacrament and her love of the Holy Eucharist and of the Holy Sacrifice.
Well, it was huge. I mean, like her husband, I mean, he went to Mass daily when he could. And the funny thing with him, he would get so involved in the contemplation of the Blessed Sacrament that he would forget about things like the collection plate. So she would drop it in for him. she was very, very, very devoted both to the Blessed Sacrament and at the same time the Sacred Heart. And this is a very important duality. If you think back to the history of the Sacred Heart, remember how bound up it is with the history of the House of Bourbon. Her ancestor, Louis XIV, did not consecrate France to the Sacred Heart. Her, you'd have to say, uncle, Louis XVI, did, but late. Too late to do any good. I mean, she was very, very much aware. Let me put it this way, if I can. Since the Last Supper, for Catholic monarchs, doing their job correctly has been considered a participation in the kingship of Christ. This is why every Catholic monarch's palace has a chapel. It's why the Habsburgs and the Bourbon and the rest of them would march in the Corpus Christi processions. One of the biggest symbols of the origin of Catholic monarchy, the union of the Davidic kingship of Christ with the communio of the church at the Last Supper, was the washing of the feet on Maundy Thursday. That was big in the court at Vienna, at Versailles, Torino, Madrid, everywhere, until the 19th century and the 20th century. The Eucharistic kingship of Jesus, the Eucharistic heart of Jesus, these were all things she meditated on, and meditated on a lot. And she always wanted to be close to the Blessed Sacrament physically, which is why she ended up living in a monastery. And in this, she echoed her husband. You know, they had the tabernacle set up right by his deathbed, so he could see the tabernacle. So, you know, one of the things, and again, we're not used to this as Americans, you cannot, in looking at her husband, really that whole sort of people, you can't separate the religious from the political. Their political efforts were, in a sense, a part of their religious efforts, and vice versa. And I mean, this was one of the things that really hit me with the Karl book. And in that book, I do a lot more introductory material than I thought my readers might be able to stand. As it turned out, I was wrong. But no, I'm serious. I mean, I really wrestled with putting that much material to the idea of Catholic monarchy and the imperial idea and all that stuff in the Karl book. But I thought there was no other way to understand him unless you knew it. And it's the same with the Zita book. There's a good deal of prehistory about her and the House of Bourbon. And just as the House of Habsburg had what was called the Pietas Austriaca, which was the kind of Catholic devotion peculiar to the Habsburgs, the Bourbon had the same thing. It was called the Religion Royale. And again, very Eucharistic. So, to answer your question, I hope you can't escape it. If you're going to understand Zita, you have to understand that was a big part of who and what she was. And if you know, people ask me, non-Catholics and so on, well, how, you know, these people are really kind of incomprehensible. Well, you'd really have to understand the doctrine of the Eucharist and Jesus' sacrifice to understand how they saw themselves, which was, in a sense, as a minor extension of that sacrifice. When you say you're trying to live by and with the kingship of Christ, it means you've got to be ready to sacrifice yourself. Greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for his friends. That was the story of Karl. It was the story of Zita. It was the story of Louis XVI and Charles I. It's the story of every decent monarch. It's the story of every decent leader. It's the story of every decent parent. You know, the way we think of a parent who would not put their children's good over their own is the way I think we ought to think of leaders who would not do the same. The fact that we're used to not being that way tells us a lot more about ourselves and about the situation we're in than it does anything else. Anyway, I hope that helps.
We have one more question.
One more question. If this is your first time here, listening to Charles's talk, you might be an oratorian in 4 years. Just a warning. Like what happened to Brother Noah. So the question being, have the people involved in the cause for Empress Zita's canonization approached you yet?
Say again, please.
The people involved in the canonization for the cause of the beatification of Empress Zita, have they ever approached you yet?
Yes, they have.
Okay, because there are a couple who were in the conference, so I was just wondering.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've had several contacts with people for both with the American cause and France and Rome. One thing I never even touched on was the introduction of her cause. She was very close to the Benedictines at Solesmes, the Benedictine nuns at Saint Cecilia, which is the companion monastery, so to speak, to Solesmes in France. Long and the short of it is that her cause was launched by the bishops of France. So that's where the sphere of gravity is with her cause. But yes, I've been in touch with them, and we've discussed different things that might be done. One of the difficulties that Karl's cause encountered is that both the church and the state in Austria were somewhat opposed to it. The state, because of course, is the heirs of the man who stabbed him in the back, makes them look bad. I mean, it should. Don't get me wrong. They've got every right to feel like what they are. But still, that was a problem. And then, because Cardinal Piffel had so egregiously betrayed Kaiser Karl, there's a certain amount of resistance on the part of the church authorities. And it really took John Paul II to say, look, here are the rules. This is why we beatify someone. This is what's going to happen. Have a nice day. But as a result, you'll find that same kind of resistance is still there for Zita. And, the only thing that can be said about it is that she will have to wait and see what sort of miracle she brings. That's what it all boils down to in the end. Are the miracles. No miracles, no beatification. So, and to be honest with you, they're not even finished with the official life story yet. I don't think they've quite done the positio.
They have to do the heroic
Virtue, right.
but there is an organization here in America also who is with the organization in Europe, and it's in the abbot in Clear Creek is the one also taking care of this organization.
And they're going to be having a conference in May at Clear Creek. That was where we first met, was at a conference there at Clear Creek. You don't mind if I tell this horrible story, do you?
You can.
Okay. Sometimes you can be made to feel real foolish. So the princess was there with her cousin, Archduke Robert, and the three of us had given separate lectures. Now I was outnumbered 2-1. Okay. 2 Habsburgs, 1 Coulombe. You know how hard that is? That's just rough. But at any rate, we gave separate lectures, but there was a joint question and answer thing. And it was going along fine, Each of them would get questions, I'd get questions, back and forth. Sometimes we would joint questions for all 3 of us or for 2, and, it was fine. But then, dun, 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 someone asked, what do you think is the current importance and place of the House of Habsburg? They looked at each other and handed me the microphone. No, it's fine. I've recovered. I managed. I said, send me money and I'll tell you. No, I didn't say the such thing. But seriously, though, that was fun. I didn't feel left out to dry. It's okay. No, I'll close. I think. Do we have any more questions? I think that's it. Yeah, good. I mean, one. I mean, great. No, I'll just say though that seriously, it's been a several years long journey. The last book I wrote before Kaiser Karl was a book on the Holy Grail. And one of the things that kept coming back to me as I was working on Karl and on Zita as well is that they were really like characters out of a medieval romance, except they were modern and alive and as exciting and as interesting and as heroic and as tragic and as this and as that as anyone you'd find in the pages of King Arthur. And even with the weird touches of the miraculous as well. You know, it was like a legend come to life. Which, at the end of the day, I'll leave you with this thought. The story of Karl and Zita shows us that the age of miracles has not ended. Which is kind of nice, because otherwise it would be the age of boredom, and I've had enough of that. Thanks so much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. I thought we could thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to your next visit, whenever that is, and I definitely look forward to reading your book. I thought that we could, and I encourage you all to read Charles's book, but I thought we could close with the prayer of asking for the beatification of servant of God Zita. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. God our Father, you redeemed the world through the atoning sacrifice of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. He who was king became the servant of all and gave his life as a ransom for many. Therefore you have exalted him. Now deign to grant your servant Zita, emperor and queen, to be raised to the honor of the altars of the church. In her you have given us an admirable example of faith and hope in the face of adversity, and an unshakable confidence in your divine providence. We beseech you that Zita, along her husband, blessed Karl, will become a model of love and marital fidelity, and be an example for families in the ways of true Christian upbringing. May she, who in every situation gave her heart to others, especially the poorest among us, be an example of service and of love of neighbor to all. And through her intercession, we ask that our prayers be granted through Christ our Lord. And may Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.